We're back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Follow us on Twitter at FDRLST. Make sure to subscribe wherever you download your podcasts as well. Today, I'm happy to be joined once again by Oren Cass. He's the executive director of American Compass. He's also the author of the fantastic book, The Once and Future Worker, which if you haven't read, you should make sure to do so. Oren, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me back.
Well, of course, this is a special Labor Day edition of the podcast, or I should say Labor Day week edition of the podcast. It's a holiday that conservatives may have marked differently in the past, but on this occasion, American Compass is out with the Better Bargain Survey, which dives into public opinion on labor unions, on what labor unions are versus what they should be, and public perception on all of these issues. So, Oren, if you could start off just by kind of breaking down the data that you released in the Better Bargain Survey on Monday, that would be fantastic. And then we can get deeper into what all of it means.
Yeah, sure. So we worked with YouGov to do a pretty big survey. So we surveyed 3,000 people, which made sure we actually had lots of people, even in fairly small segments of the survey, to really try to understand attitudes about their own jobs, about organized labor as it operates today in unions, and then also about what kind of representation they might like to have in the workplace. And we found, to some extent, I think, confirmed our hypothesis, but also went much beyond what I would have guessed, which was just that workers hate unions being involved in politics. It is the number one reason they would vote against a union. It is the thing they least want to see doing. And maybe unsurprisingly, and along with that, then, the labor movement isn't really for workers anymore. If you look at folks in the lower and working classes who you think of as kind of the quintessential reason to have organized labor, they're entirely alienated from it, don't know or think much about it at all, don't see it as relevant to their lives. And then you have these college-educated middle and upper class Democrats who are who are still super excited about it. And so I think it nicely captured both all the ways that the labor movement has gone wrong, but also speaks to the enormous opportunity there would be to have an actual movement out there that represented workers in the ways they want and need to be represented.
Yeah, and you just mentioned one of the numbers that stuck out to me, which was that labor unions were viewed more positively by upper class workers than they were, or upper class respondents in the survey than they were by middle class, working class people. And I imagine, as somebody who follows those issues, and I wanted to ask you this, that must not have been surprising to you at all.
No, not especially. And it's striking. It's not just that upper and middle class voters are more enthusiastic among Democrats. It's also that upper and middle class voters are much more unfavorably inclined among Republicans. So you sort of see this way that, labor has really become this sort of middle and upper class political battleground between the sort of socially progressive left and the socially conservative right. And then as you move down the income and education scale and look at lower and working class voters, their views about this stuff are much less partisan. In fact, their views are much more similar to each other than they are to the more educated voters in either party. And so what you're left with is not even so much that they have a favorable or unfavorable view, but that they have no real view at all. What I found most fascinating was we asked, how would you want to hear politicians speaking about unions? And again, you can guess your college-educated Democrats are very excited about it. Your college-educated Republicans and higher-income Republicans, really don't like the idea of support for unions. And then you have the lower and working classes for whom the most popular answers are either don't know or would just assume it'd be ignored. It's just, it does not connect to them as something that's even relevant to their lives or policy at this point.
So what did people say that labor unions should be doing? That was one of the questions you asked. I think actually 3% said, when you asked what are the most important things for labor unions to be doing, and I might be off on the phrasing there, only 3% said engaging in politics. So what do people want labor unions, and what do they want them to do, and what do they think they should be doing?
Yeah, the top responses are what you would expect them to be if you just use some common sense, which are like collective bargaining and providing benefits and training and working out workplace disputes. Workers really do want to have that kind of representation in the workplace. And the training and benefits point, I think, is especially interesting, because this is a way that American unions really differ to a significant degree from other models around the world, and what labor means, for instance, in Europe. Because of the way labor works in America, you have these fights company by company, and then either you're a unionized company or a non-unionized company, and you as a worker don't really have any say in whether you want to be a union member or not. It's all a question of where you work. What you see elsewhere in the world is that unions are bigger than that. Unions are things that operate outside of and beyond companies, and you're a union member because the union actually does valuable things for you. And I think that's something that has incredible potential in America, and that we tested explicitly. So at the end of the survey, we actually tried a couple of what we're calling these better bargains. What are different things that aren't exactly what one side or the other might want, but could really be better for workers. And one thing we asked is, well, how would you feel about a policy reform that said unions could no longer spend money on politics, but they could spend money and also get money from employers and the government to spend on providing health or insurance benefits to workers, providing training to workers? That was wildly popular and almost entirely nonpartisan. So by more than 2-1, that was supported by Democrats, independents, and Republicans. Likewise, it was supported lower, middle, working, upper class. Everyone recognizes ultimately that would be a better thing for unions to be doing. Of course, the one group that doesn't feel that way is the Democratic Party, because if that's what unions were doing, Democrats would lose what is a huge source of their political support, even if it is not actually something that's providing meaningful value to workers at this point.
It's fascinating because that's one of those reforms that would actually allow labor unions to funnel more money into what Democrats purport labor unions should be spending their resources to help workers on. And we actually had Bill McMorris of the Washington Free Beacon on this podcast a couple of months ago. He wrote a great piece. I mean, it was really more of an investigation in the Free Beacon about how when you have a higher proportion of labor union members now coming from, let's say they're from teachers unions or journalists, as opposed to perhaps blue collar workers, it creates a situation where those cultural divides become more and more salient. And I'm curious for your take, Oren, on why it is that those cultural issues are becoming, those divisive cultural issues are becoming more divisive in this context in and of themselves.
Yeah, I thought Bill's piece was fantastic. And in my mind, there are two kind of really important trends that we have to think about in the context of labor. One is exactly what you described, that labor is more becoming the bastion of public employees, nurses, teachers, and then private sector mostly in sort of a few very liberal enclaves. And so it's an odd sort of circular problem where, people on the right of center say, oh, unions are these, left-wing things. And so, we should be opposed to unions. But of course, it is in part the right of center's opposition to unions that have led to their decline in exactly the places where they would be more conservative. So a labor movement that was overwhelmingly made up of private sector workers in, industries that actually make things, for instance, would obviously be a much more conservatively oriented institution than what we're left with, where only progressives support it. It only really still thrives in very progressive bastions. And unsurprisingly, then it looks extremely progressive. So one point is, I think it's important to recognize that if labor really were a force that were more geographically diverse, that were more sectorally diverse, it would also be more politically diverse. And you, in fact, see this in, the construction trades. It's one of the few places where you have still very effective private sector unions, and they're not liberal at all. So that's one important thing. And then the second one, and this goes directly to your point about the sort of socially divisive issues, is that it's really important to recognize how just incoherent it is to ask labor to be operating in national politics at this point. I was presenting at a law school event recently on this point that workers don't really want politics in unions, and the law professor, sort of taking the other side, said, that's outrageous. Labor is inherently political, and of course labor has to be political. And I said, that's fine in theory, but look at the actual political issues we fight about in this country and look what workers actually think about them. It is impossible to say, well, here is what workers want politically, because there is no alignment between people's economic and socioeconomic status today and their political views. So I'm totally open to the idea that you could find some political issue where, workers based on their economic interests really all felt the same way, or, overwhelming majority did, and that would be fine. But in reality, when you poll workers, you find that they essentially look like the population, depending on how you cut it, maybe a few points to the left of the population. And so saying, well, and therefore they must be a force for, progressive politics, is certainly misguided, and ultimately is part of what is destroying the labor movement and ensuring that it can't build the kind of solidarity among workers that workers actually want and need.
So part of the problem seems to be that we no longer agree on what constitutes politics, like the definition of what is in and of itself political. You can have that conversation about collective bargaining, but if you ask, for instance, a teacher whether transgender bathrooms are a political issue, they may say, no, this is human rights, this is civility, this is decency. If you ask a steelworker that question, you'll get a very, very different answer. And so some of the problem is just that we are so divided right now that we can't even agree on the basic definition of what constitutes politics. So labor unions engaging in politics means something very, very different to these two sort of categories, blue collar and white collar, to just sort of use that rough definition. And that's a really huge issue, I would imagine, for people who are in these unions and see their money getting directed more and more and more to divisive issues and because one side doesn't see those issues as being particularly divisive at all, and that creates this incredible alienation among members of labor unions themselves.
Right. I think the Amazon unionizing drive recently in Bessemer, Alabama is such a fascinating example of this, because I think in sort of objective economic terms, it's hard to find a better case for a union than Amazon. I mean, Amazon has an extraordinary reputation for just pushing the envelope on every labor practice it can think of and only backing off under intense public relations pressure. And wouldn't it be nice if actually workers had some collective way to represent their own interests? That seems like it makes, an awful lot of sense. I recently learned, I literally didn't believe this when I heard it. So I went, let's make sure this is actually true. As part of the organizing campaign, the union put signs outside the warehouse of the classic old Rosie the Riveter signs, but with Stacey Abrams's face photoshopped over Rosie the Riveter.
Governor Stacey Abrams.
I'm just imagining being, a worker driving into work at the Amazon warehouse, and maybe you're for the union, maybe you're against the union, but well, what this is really about, Stacey Abrams is probably just about the most destructive and counterproductive thing you could do as a union organizer if you wanted people to actually think, gosh, my economic interests and my actual concerns in this workplace will be attended to if I vote for this union. And the union, I was shocked by how catastrophically that organizing drive failed. I mean, they got roughly 1 in 8 workers to vote for the union. About half just didn't even vote at all. And among those who did, it failed dramatically. And so there's almost this sort of kind of woke labor dynamic alongside woke capital now, where you have whoever it is that's leading these unions seems to feel compelled for some reason to believe that, what everyone really wants is to make this about woke politics. And that is just not, in fact, how to represent workers effectively.
You just mentioned something that I wanted to ask you about, which is the legitimate need, which some conservatives may sincerely be unfamiliar with, the legitimate need that you just mentioned the Amazon example, but the legitimate need that some workers have for more robust representation and for a more robust labor movement. You mentioned in the survey that these perception issues are a huge obstacle to that. But having mentioned the Amazon example, if you could get into a little bit of, there's this number in the survey, 1 in 3 workers have, what you could define as a secure job. And when you control for college education, that number drops to actually 1 in 5 workers. Can you talk to us a little bit about those numbers, and then maybe talk to us a little bit more about why corporations are behaving in a way that would demand, in some cases, representation from a labor union?
Yeah, so the secure job point is from this survey, and I think that's, you sort of framed the transition exactly right, which is, as anyone who's listened to the first part of this podcast can tell, I am not an enthusiast for unions as they are operating in this country. But I think for a long time, conservatives and the right of center generally have started from that analysis and then said, well, therefore labor bad, right? Let's just kind of cheer its demise. And I think step 2 has to be very different than that, especially for conservatives, which is to say, this is actually a tragedy. I mean, for conservatives, there are so many reasons we should want a healthy labor movement. We should want workers to have these kinds of institutions in their communities. We should want workers to be on an equal playing field with employers so that the government doesn't have to step in and make all the rules and redistribute the income. And as you mentioned from the survey, it's very clear that there are real problems in the labor market today. So, we defined a secure job in the survey as income is at least $40,000 a year. Predictability of income, meaning people said they felt they had some ability to predict what their income would be for the year to come. Predictability of hours, that they had a steady schedule and knew what that would be, and health benefits. So, we're not describing this in sort of, outrageously luxurious terms here. And as you said, already the overwhelming majority of jobs are not secure jobs. And when you look at those without a college degree, it's even more dramatic. And so you have, I think, this sort of bubble of economists and economic analysts and policymakers who, I think a lot is remarked on in terms of, we tend to all be college educated and have come from a lot of the same pathways. But even in just the basic structure of what employment looks like, we sort of take for granted that a job will have certain characteristics. And for the most part, they don't. And, those are exactly the kinds of things that some form of labor that was representing workers and negotiating with management would be in a very good position to obtain better conditions on.
Now, if you've ever been behind the wheel of a high-performance sports car and you realize just how much better a car can be, you never want to settle for those quote-unquote regular cars again. I have a colleague who swears the same thing is true about her X-Chair. From the moment she first sat down in it, she understood why so many people consider X-Chair to be the finest office chair in the world. I'm telling you, I'm so jealous of it. I noticed right away when that X-Chair came in the mail for her, because suddenly she just seemed to have so much more motivation at work and just seemed to be working overtime because that X-Chair just makes it so much more enjoyable. Can your current office chair give you a massage while you're working? The X-Chair can. That explains why my colleague is working so much. Can your current office chair heat up or cool down? The X-Chair can. It's all in the Elemax massage and temperature regulation, exclusively designed and made for X-Chair. And once you feel the customized support of X-Chair's patented dynamic variable lumbar, or DVL, your back will never be happy in any other chair again. Now, take my advice. Try out X-Chair for yourself, risk-free, for 30 days. Once you realize how much better your chair should be, you will never go back. Go to xchairfederalist.com now. That's the letter X, chair, FEDERALIST.com for $100 off your order. XChair has a 30-day guarantee of complete comfort. xchairfederalist.com. I have to ask about the gig economy. This is something that Tim Carney actually writes about to fascinating effect in Alienated America, in how jobs that are associated with the gig economy or jobs that are created by the gig economy have a deleterious effect on some communities, because it's very different than the sort of company town model. You have, for instance, people who are just disconnected from a work community or a big work environment. You're your own boss. You do it when you can. And that does seriously have an effect on particular communities, especially in terms of change. So I'm really curious for your perspective, Oren, on how the rise of the gig economy has added or exacerbated some of these problems.
So you're certainly right that gig work would typically not qualify as a secure job. We specifically asked people whether or not their primary employment was what we would call gig work, and particularly, work through an online platform. And consistent with a lot of surveys, the actual share of the population engaged in that kind of employment remains very low, in a couple of percentage points. So I think one thing you have to do is stack on top of that everybody who is, an on-call worker, or a temp, or a contractor, because, who in the past would have been a full-time employee, but now they're being treated as a contractor instead, or somebody who only gets their schedule for each, 2 weeks in advance, and so on and so forth. And it's really when you start to stack all of those categories up together, that you start to see this insecurity on top of just generally jobs that don't pay especially well and don't come with a lot of benefits. And you're exactly right, to Tim Carney's point, that these things tend not to be great for individuals. One thing we ask people is, okay, what kind of employment do you have? What kind of employment do you want to have? And notwithstanding the narrative that, like, oh, this is great and it gives people so much flexibility. It's good that these things exist, and there are people who like that flexibility, but by and large, people are not doing this because they love the flexibility. They would prefer something that looks like a secure job, and so it's certainly important to them. But then, to your and Tim's broader point, it's also integral to their families and their communities and the society. So many of the things outside of the market that we value are dependent on the market staying in its own lane, in a sense. And when we start to sort of convert all of life into a market and say, well, gosh, wouldn't it be efficient? And couldn't we provide things to people more cheaply if workers were just accessibly on call at all hours of the day, whenever it might most closely match demand? Sure, let's stipulate that that's super efficient. But then we also have to notice all the things that the market's not going to pay any attention to, which is what that does to relationships, what that does to parenting, what that does to your ability to be involved in the community. You can't be a little league coach if you don't know what your hours are. And if most people don't sort of have similar regular schedules, you don't also have similar regular times to be doing other things. There's just a wonderful paper. Sorry, this is a little bit random, but I like to mention whenever I can, by a professor at Cornell named Christabel Young, called "Time is a Network Good." And his point is that, economists have gotten very good at analyzing things like, internet access or smartphones as what are called network goods, where they actually become more valuable to you as more other people also have them. And his point is that time itself is a network good, that having free time, for instance, is way, way, way more valuable to you when other people also have the same free time. And that the free time in the middle of a Wednesday, if there's nothing going on, is not the same as free time in the evenings, which is the time that or on the weekend, which is the time when everyone has agreed that non-work things are going to be happening. And so it's really important to keep in mind that as we sort of hand more of control over to the market, we're going to lose a lot of things, and we are losing a lot of things that the market just doesn't pay attention to because there's no price attached to it.
I have to broach the sort of devil's advocate argument because you make this argument in a lot of conservative spaces, and should, let's say, pro-business, maybe even middle-class small business owners in this broader conservative fold be concerned that should this new conception of a labor movement be realized, it would cost jobs. Is this something that should be concerning to people, first of all? And then secondly, is it also partially, and this isn't a leading question, I'm genuinely curious, that if it were realized, it would mean a reorganization of the labor market and a reorganization of people into perhaps healthier jobs? What would this look like? And should people be concerned?
There are certainly forms of labor and practices of organized labor that can be very economically destructive. One thing that's quite unique, again, to the American system is the way that because we go and organize company by company, then force each individual company to negotiate their own union contract. And this is something that, rightly leads companies to sort of strongly resist unionization. If a union drive succeeds at my company and not my competitors, well, now I'm in big trouble. That's actually kind of a weird system and not a very good system. And again, not the way labor often works. So we've already talked about one mechanism through which labor could be performing a much more valuable function, which is to be doing things like training and benefits. So if you think of a union, and again, the construction trades are a really wonderful example of this, where, I think employment in construction already looks different in a lot of ways from our kind of typical work for a particular company kind of jobs. And so unions have, in a sense, had to play more of this role. But in a sense, for many people, the union is their main touch point with employment. They almost feel more that they are employed by the union. The union provides training, the union connects them to jobs, the union defines the terms and conditions that they work under, and then provides a lot of the kinds of benefits also that you might otherwise get from a traditional employer. And that is enormously valuable. That promotes, I think, a healthy labor market. And so something that we should be thinking about is, more broadly, to what extent can unions be more like that, more things that operate at the industry or occupation level, that you are a member of, not because you work for company X and company X voted for a union, but that you're a member of because you have a particular job or trade or profession, and therefore have many interests in common with many other people in that job or trade or profession. There's value to you in joining together in that kind of organization. And you then have a common group of employers with whom to deal. So if you think about janitors, for instance, trying to organize all the janitors at a single company to unionize at a company is essentially impossible, especially because a lot of the times the janitors are outsourced contractors anyway. If you said, well, actually, there's a janitors union in New York, and janitors are members of it by virtue of being janitors, they choose to be members of it, and people in New York who employ janitors have to bargain with that union, well, that's a very different relationship, right? And so, absolutely, it's not perfect. Any business owner is going to complain that they are losing power relative to the janitors in that situation. But if you think about who is doing well and who is not doing well in society today, I would like to see those business owners lose some power to those janitors. And I think conservatives should want to see that happen. And I think we really have to recognize that the alternative to that happening is not just this hypothetically glorious free market that just runs on its own. It's going to be government redistribution and regulation. And we should really prefer and be investing in and pushing toward a model where workers have institutions they can be part of that represent them and that can bargain on equal footing with their employers, with the business community generally, to work out arrangements that both sides are going to be able to live with.
Speaking of which, Senator Rubio, one of the things he floated when he supported the unionization drive in Bessemer was the idea that someday employees conservative employees may need to look to labor unions as a way to fight basically woke capital, to fight back against their employers forcing wokeism and woke ideology on them in various ways. And actually, we had Ben Shapiro on this podcast fairly recently, and he, came out and said there is a conservative case for collective bargaining. And so this conversation that is being generated on the right, and in no small part thanks to American Compass and you and the great work that you all do, it basically comes to this point where we have to think about what the common ground is, sort of on a very practical policy level. And I want to put that question to you. What is the common ground on that sort of like practical, immediate policy level? What is some of the reform, and what are some of the reform ideas that people can genuinely get behind here that can move the ball forward for workers?
Well, so alongside this survey, we're putting out 3 specific policy papers, each of which takes the form of one of these, what we're calling better bargains, which are intended to suggest ways that, policymakers could pursue reforms that business isn't going to love, that big labor isn't going to love, but that you could see the result of actually really being to the benefit of workers. So one of them is the one I mentioned that we actually tested in the survey, which is this idea that you actually get unions out of politics. You essentially say, now look, if you want to have the kind of unions we have today and be a member of a union that's going around endorsing political candidates, fine. But let's create an entity that looks like a union in the sense that its purpose is to represent and serve workers, but is in a sense closer to a 501c3 nonprofit. So it has restrictions on the kinds of political activities it can engage in. But on the flip side, it has other real advantages. It can partner with employers and receive employer money to, whether that's providing benefits or training. And it can also be a conduit for public programs, whether that's workforce development or unemployment insurance. And so let's create that entity as an option. And again, you can see why big labor is not going to be excited about that. You can see why big business is not going to be excited about that. But you can see why both conservatives and workers and ultimately progressives who are genuinely interested in good outcomes for workers should be very interested in that. So that's one example. Two others I think that have a lot of potential. One is the idea of finding different forms for worker voice. So totally independent of what we think of as like the two sides sitting down at the table and, bargaining and then striking and whatever else. One of the things we found in the survey is really things that workers value more, even than kind of the objective security of their job, is the sense that they have enough voice in the workplace and good relations with management. That's by far the top determinant of their job satisfaction. And so providing them other ways to do that without having to have a union that we have today, I think would be hugely valuable. So one mechanism for that is what's called a works council, which is a very kind of local, in your workplace labor management committee, where we're not bargaining over wages, but we can actually talk about, are we adopting new technologies? How do we do scheduling? These kinds of things that workers have very legitimate concerns about and interests and good advice on. Unfortunately, doing that is literally illegal today under our labor law because it would conflict with union organizing. So make that kind of thing legal, but then also on the flip side, say, it would make a lot of sense to give workers voice more at the board level. We're not going to do what we have in Germany, where you potentially have almost a majority of the board be workers. That's not something we're going to do tomorrow in the United States. But put one worker representative on the board, and particularly say to management, look, if you want to set up this kind of labor management committee at the worksite level, you also have to let that group put one representative on the board. And that I think would also be an incredibly powerful way of expanding voice and representation, and really just assigning value and respect to what workers bring to the business community and to the operation of the business. So that's number two. And then the third one goes to the idea I was just describing about janitors negotiating with employers. That model is typically called sectoral bargaining because the bargain is at the level of the sector. It's all the janitors and everybody who employs janitors. And to make that work, the flip side thing you would have to do is give a lot of flexibility from federal law. So the bargain here would be, look, if everybody wants to live under all the onerous federal regulation and do everything that way, they can. But if you as a city or a state want to set up a system where you're actually going to have recognized representatives of your workers and representatives of the business community, and they're going to come together to bargain, let them bargain about those regulations. Let them say, you know what, we don't think this regulation makes sense. We think this other thing would be much more valuable. And you don't have to worry about kind of workers getting taken advantage of, because the whole point is you've set up a structure where they have very significant representation. And so that, again, is a bargain where, you know, are companies excited about having to bargain with workers? Probably not. Are they excited about the idea that they could actually then find arrangements that make a lot more sense than federal regulation? I think that would be very appealing. And so I think that's something that probably even more so in red states than in blue states, you could really see people getting excited about. Hey, different model of labor, model that is less damaging to specific businesses, and model that lets our actual business community and workers come up with their own arrangements that don't come from Washington, D.C.
That's really interesting. And you had some tweets recently, Oren, that have about private equity and hedge funds that have rankled some veterans of those industries. You don't hear much on the right about the excesses of, say, PE. I mean, I guess there was the Brokaw Act, which was sponsored by, it was Tammy Baldwin's bill, co-sponsored by David Perdue, about the town of Brokaw, Wisconsin, which literally disappeared after PE bought out the paper mill there, which was the center of the industry in the town. And so I guess you hear some of it from the right, but not hardly enough, because again, it does seem in this era where conservatives are having these conversations as though this particular area is just absolutely ripe for conservative reform.
I certainly think so, obviously. You know, I think one of the things that's so powerful about the issue, though, is that it really goes to sort of fundamental economic assumptions that we have on the right of center. And in that respect, it's a lot like the China free trade issue, where it was like, gosh, if you just look at what's going on in China, this makes no sense. But we have this like absolute dogma that more free trade is always better. And you see now, as people have had to admit, like, actually, guys, this we cannot defend this any longer. Really, the implication of that was a much more fundamental thinking about how do markets work in this sort of international context, and how would trade that's actually good for America look. And I think something similar needs to go on in the financial market context, where right now we have on the right of center this dogma that profit equals value, that if you've earned a lot of money, it must be because you did something super valuable. And in fact, by definition, the fact that you earn the money is what proves that you did something super valuable. And as long as that's true, well, then hedge funds and private equity are not only sort of insulated from attack, they are like our greatest beacons of value and wonderfulness, right? Like, look at all of the profit. They must be doing wonderful things. You know, look at this guy who bought Bitcoin at 600 and sold it at 60,000. He must be creating so much value for our society. And so actually scrutinizing that and looking at the most absurd excesses of it and saying this is just not defensible any longer. It is obviously in some cases, when taken to its extremes, incredibly corrosive to communities. It's also incredibly corrosive to public finances. I mean, we have all of these public pension funds massively invested in these private equity funds and hedge funds that are delivering horrible returns. And you know who's on the hook for that? Taxpayers. It's not even the retirees who are ultimately on the hook, because the taxpayers are going to have to make up the difference. And so saying like, well, gosh, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Shouldn't be that hard, but it is very hard, because when you admit that it doesn't make sense, you also have to admit that just because someone earned a lot of money doesn't mean they did anything very valuable. And that is going to be hard for some of the more dogmatic some of our more dogmatic friends on the right of center to admit. But I think it is crucially important for conservatives to actually move forward and think more constructively about public policy. And by the way, I can think of a few things more conservative than recognizing that just because someone made a lot of money doesn't mean they did anything very useful.
100%. The PE racket with pensions is like absolutely unbelievable when you dig into the way that they like bribe certain public employees with junkets in order to get them to continue, giving them control of their pension funds. It's really unbelievable. Now, Oren, before we run, I want to ask you about the Edgerton Essays, which is a publication that you guys just released with the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a wonderful collection of essays. What were some of your takeaways from that? I mean, I read every single one of them, and I found them very poignant, but also very helpful. What were your biggest takeaways from some of the voices that project amplified?
Yeah, thanks for asking about that. We had a really good time doing this project. It really started out of conversations I was having with some of our contributing writers who sort of wanted to write about, what they heard out doing work in the real world, essentially. And I said, well, why can't we just get some of those people to write for us themselves? And as my interlocutors warned me, it's actually extremely hard to do that. And Patrick Brown, who edited the series, wrote a really nice piece for us talking about just how some of the broader trends of institutional and social breakdown also then create very concrete problems of like, how do you find people who have opinions that they want to share, and how can they feel comfortable sharing them? But ultimately, I think we've published about 20 of these essays, and what's been by far most interesting to me is just how different they sound from the debates that we have in policymaking circles. And I don't mean they have different opinions, like you and I like policy X, but they want policy Y. I mean, the way that they approach questions of policy, the set of views they have just don't look anything like our political debates. They don't see the same connections between public policy and their own lives that we assume. And their collection of beliefs do not map naturally onto what we would describe as the Democratic agenda or the Republican agenda. And instead, what you see is that by and large, they have sort of extremely practical problems of competent governance. And
they prioritize those concerns over the ideological ones, like the practical ones were tantamount.
Yes, that's right. And that's one of the places the disconnect emerges is by and large, you can read these and sort of guess where the writers would land ideologically. We very explicitly did not filter for that. And I think it comes through that there's quite a balance or distribution on that front. But their ideological starting point is not in any way a predictor of the issue that they want to talk about or what they would like to see done about it. And so, the two real takeaways for me were, one, there is a much bigger problem of just, basic public services and governance that should have a much bigger role in our discussion of public policy than, grand visions for reform of this or that. And two, that I think the electorate is much more open to change and new messages than the consultants assume. And in a sense, this is sort of a lesson of the Trump era, right? Like in 2016, you had 16 candidates who had their exact list of bullet points that consultants had assured them were how you win a Republican Party. And then Donald Trump showed up and was just like, I'm just going to say, whatever I want. And it was like, oh, you can't say that. And oh, you can't say that. And it turned out like, well, actually, there are very few things you can or can't say. And I think that goes far beyond Donald Trump. I think almost all of the assumptions we have about, oh, well, Republicans think this. Now, yes, Republicans in Washington think this, but people who ultimately vote Republican don't necessarily think this. And the set of reasons they ultimately vote one way or the other are far more complex and less related to policy agendas than we policy wonks would like to think. And in one respect, that's very frustrating. But in the other respect, and this is why it's so important to something like the American Compass Project, I think it really underscores the fact that thinking differently and starting from a place of actually trying to understand what the problems are in the country and how public policy could address them is not some sort of dangerous undermining of a well-established coalition. It's an incredibly important process, and it's one that can lead toward the development of better policy and also potentially a governing majority.
Yeah, and voting patterns have changed so much in recent years. But Oren, I know you have to run, so thank you so much for your time today. We certainly always appreciate it.
This was awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Well, you can read the survey, the Better Bargain Survey, over at the American Compass website. You can also read the Edgerton essays there as well. You've been listening to Oren Cass. He's the executive director of American Compass. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. We'll be back soon with more Federalist Radio Hour. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.
Darling, you got me right where you